Welcome, and thank you so much for being here this morning, or good afternoon, if that's the time it is where you are. It's going to be a really important session, and we have a huge amount of ground to cover. COVID-19 transformed the healthcare systems, sometimes in the worst possible way. We saw overcrowded wards, and we saw problems with supply chains for things like PPE. But it's also created opportunities to look for other ways to transform the healthcare systems, to make them more resilient in the future. And we're going to be talking about those as well. So it won't be the most depressing session, I promise. I'd love to introduce our panelists. We have a real range today, all the way from hospitals to medical device makers to pharma companies. So first of all, we have Emmanuel Lignier, who is the Chief Executive Officer of Citivia, which is a provider of technologies and services. It used to be GE Healthcare Life Sciences. Randy Kellogg, who is the President and CEO of Omron Healthcare. And Anton Decker, who's the President International of the Mayo Clinic. And Aubrey Dan, who's the co-founder and Executive Chairman of Empower Farm. Now, I'm going to let them tell you a little bit more about what they do and how their lives and their work has been changed by COVID-19, and also how they are changing the pandemic right now.
So my name is Dr. Anton Decker. I'm the president for Mayo Clinic International. Mayo Clinic is a global multi-system, multi-site health system. We see patients from 140 countries every year, employ over 70,000 people, and see in excess of 1.2 million patients a year. I'm a gastroenterologist by background, and the accent will tell you that I'm originally from South Africa. Mayo Clinic, just like every other person or health organization in the world, has been affected by COVID. And I like the way that you introduced the session, in that it isn't all doom and gloom. We've learned a lot about ourselves, and we've learned a lot about healthcare and what we're capable of in just these last few months. Let me give you a few examples. Firstly, COVID has shown us just how quickly we can innovate. All you need to do is look at virtual care, virtual visits, telehealth, and we've probably compressed something that would have taken 10 or 15 years into the space of a few weeks or months. And this certainly has been the case at Mayo Clinic. We've made it easy for people to get virtual visits anywhere in the world. And we've even worked through things that we thought were undoable, regulations, payment, you name it, all because we've had to. So I find it absolutely fascinating how quickly we can innovate when we really need to. The pandemic has also highlighted the need for cooperation across the globe, the importance of public-private partnerships, the importance of science-guided partnerships and data sharing, the importance of multi-organizational cooperation. And I think we're doing this reasonably well. And again, the need to reinvent ourselves, or the urgency to reinvent ourselves, has made us do this faster. I've been fascinated by the advances in technology. Even just look at this meeting would have been difficult a year or so ago. And, who doesn't nowadays sit on multiple virtual meetings every day, and they just work. I know a year ago they were clumsy and weren't working very well. Many other examples of the rapid advances in technology because of COVID. And then, of course, there's the advance in the medical science, as we rapidly are finding new treatment modalities and working on a vaccine, as you know very well. And lastly, I would say that the pandemic has shown us just how resilient we can be. This has not been pleasant for anyone, and certainly not for the healthcare industry, and very much, and not for patients, of course. But it has shown us that we are resilient, and we are going to find a way out of this.
Yes, we do hope to provide some hope in this session. Randy, why don't you tell us a little bit about your work at Omron and how that has changed during the pandemic?
Thank you. Good morning. I'm Randy Kellogg, CEO, President of Omron Healthcare. I lead the Americas for Omron Healthcare. We are a company that's been well invested in taking care of people at home with technology and devices and services that allow people to upload blood pressure readings and other things, other medical readings to their physician, to electronic health records, etc. We've had a lot of transition here during the last 9 months. As you can see, I'm speaking to you from my home in suburban Chicago, Illinois. Our entire team has been remote since March, and we intend to stay remote probably until March, if not a little bit later. But the good news is that what we've been doing, connecting devices to clinicians, from patients to clinicians, has been very effective. We've actually been lucky in that we had started in the remote patient monitoring market several months, actually almost a year before the pandemic started. And we've been able to rapidly expand the ability to measure people's blood pressure, their weight, their SpO2, whatever medical symptoms or medical vitals that the physician is looking for at home, and upload them, which has been extremely important during this era of COVID, as people are not very interested in going to the doctor and leaving their homes. And it ties well with the telemedicine you just heard about. And it helps people with chronic conditions actually get those readings in front of the people that can do something with it.
Yeah, I think remote care is becoming a big theme, and we'll definitely touch upon that later. Aubrey, why don't you tell us a bit about your company and how you're adapting in the pandemic?
Sure. Good morning. You're speaking to Aubrey Dan, and I am the the co-founder and the executive chairman to Empower Farm. We are an early stage pharmaceutical company that is developing a synthetic CBD product. The product is geared towards the treatment of anxiety. We are now at the beginning stages, about to go into phase 1. What we have basically done is that we see that there's a tremendous market out there where there are so many patients suffering, and you talk about just say the overall ramifications to COVID. The pandemic is not just about being sick. The pandemic is really about mental health, and there's been a tremendous challenge going on. So right now, we're now currently in the planning stages of going through the different phases. We anticipate that we'll have a GMP facility shortly. We know that, for example, in Canada, there's a shortage of supplies because more and more people are beginning to hoard up. Because we are an essential service, we've been fortunate to have worked through this whole time period of the fact that we can develop just say pharmaceuticals, which is very, very important. What we're seeing here is the fact that today the physicians need more prescriptions to help them out in just say their prescribing habits. We're finding that the overall available pharmaceutical treatment options are not sufficient to support a spike in population rates of anxiety and depression. The products that are currently now on the market really have significant side effects, which really include potential of addiction. There is a gap in the patented medicines in the public formularies to treat anxiety. This has really become a huge pandemic now and will continue to grow.
Yeah. And I think, the mental health costs we're only just starting to count them. So look forward to getting into that with you as well. I'd like to say to the audience, now you have a sense of who's on the panel, do send in questions. We will be taking questions at the end, or if they're incredibly relevant, I may buck the trend and come to them in the middle as well. So I'd like to start off by looking back. Unfortunately, earlier this week, I wrote a story about hospitals filling up again across the US. So unfortunately, it's not just looking back, but From those early days of when the pandemic hit the Americas, what do we know about what lessons we've learnt? What did it show us about the kind of healthcare system that we have, both the advantages and the disadvantages of it? And I'm going to throw that to Anton first.
So, sure, good question. Advantages and disadvantages when it hit. Let's start with the advantages. I think, as I said in my opening remarks, it has shown us that we do have the building blocks. There is actually a global health system, albeit fragmented and imperfect, but we've got the building blocks. We needed the incentive, and this is, unfortunately, COVID is somewhat of a morbid incentive to get our act together. So it has shown us how resilient we can be. It has shown us how entrepreneurial we can be. And it has shown us how well we can cooperate and share data. Scientists have always shared data and cooperated across countries, but this is really taking it to a new level because we've had to. So I think then moving on to our weaknesses, there are many, unfortunately. Globally, certainly early on, we could feel that the world was crying out for a voice of a trusted source of truth. And no one quite knew who to go to as the trusted source of truth. And we've certainly, Mayo Clinic, being a leader in a global leader in healthcare, have tried to fill that void. But the US, the Americas, the world was crying out for a source of truth. What do we need to do with this global pandemic? It has shown us just how fragmented the health system is and was. We've always known that, but didn't again quite have the incentive to defragment it. And then the other weakness was just the lack of collaboration between industries, between private and public sector, and globally. Again, the wires were there, as it were, but it wasn't quite happening because there wasn't an incentive. So a few strengths, lots of weaknesses, but it's been a fascinating a time of our lives to see this unfold. And as you know, it's unfolding by the day.
Yeah. And you mentioned the international cooperation. Perhaps if you weren't in a hospital, you don't know what kind of international cooperation was going on. Well, what did you see?
Well, on many levels. So firstly, we've had to deal with simple things, not simple, but things like travel restrictions. So there, Mayo Clinic sees thousands of patients globally in our various sites, and many of these patients haven't been able to travel. So we've had to find ways to treat them remotely. Now, if you're going to treat someone remotely, there are two sides to that equation. There's the Mayo physician in their office, but the patient at home or at their provider would have to have the technology and also the resources to be treated. And I think that's one of the hidden gems that is learnings that has come from this pandemic, is how well we're learning to do that. We recently had a patient in London who believed that, or was concerned that they had pancreatic cancer. It wasn't feasible for them to travel to see one of our pancreatologists in Rochester, Minnesota. We did a sophisticated virtual visit, including a review of the radiological imaging studies, and were able to reassure the patient that they in fact did not have a malignant or pre-malignant condition. Now, just think of how we've helped that person's life. They haven't had to travel halfway across the world, and they had been told by multiple physicians that they had pancreatic cancer. So that's in the whole bucket of virtual visits. From a science perspective, scientists have always worked together across borders. It's one of the beautiful things about scientists, as one of the Mayo brothers says, science knows no country. But that has really been accelerated as well. Just our ability to share data and even overcome hurdles that may have prevented the safe and sharing of data, considering data privacy laws and things like that.
Yeah, no, that's fascinating. And Randy, that actually speaks, the element about remote care speaks to what you were mentioning. I mean, what did it show about health systems' ability to do remote care? Because we're not just talking about COVID patients, we're talking about all those patients that were suffering from chronic diseases and weren't getting much in-person contact.
I think the word that I would use is adaptive. Clinicians, hospital systems, patients had to be adaptive to new things and do it quickly. So what we've seen is where in the past it might have taken 9 months to a year to bring up a remote patient monitoring program at a facility, it now happens in weeks. So there's a much more fever to make it happen quicker, and to adapt that information to their process so they can effectively take care of those patients. Especially in our situation, it's chronic disease patients, someone who has their blood pressure out of control. In the U.S., that's 37 million people. So there are a lot of people that need to get their blood pressure under control. It can be an underlying condition. It can make COVID worse should they get it. But the good news is that now there are systems and ways to bring that information quickly to the physician. And it doesn't even have to be a televisit. It can be information that shows up in their electronic health record with alerts that allow the physician to then reach back out to the patient and say, hey, what's happening? Did you stop taking your medication? Do you not even have your medication? Asking those questions that might not be asked if they didn't see the information that was coming in from the patient.
Aubrey, you mentioned supply chain problems, and I was wondering what lessons there were to be learned. What did we learn about the advantages and disadvantages of our supply chains during the real panicked period earlier in the year?
Well, there's no question that from a countrywide perspective, basically Canada doesn't have the infrastructure to manufacture our own. So therefore, we are very reliant upon our external partners. You think about most vaccines are not being just as manufactured here. They are being manufactured abroad. So depending upon the political willingness of the different countries and the overall supply process, will we actually see the products here? The real difficulty that I see from a pharmaceutical perspective is that you're listening to the media and different particulars of politicians are promising, yes, we're going to have the vaccine November, or we're going to have it next month. What most people don't realize that the process is all about safety and efficacy. It's a very, very long process. Basically, these companies that are manufacturing the vaccine are truncating a process that typically takes years and years and years. And I think that if the public believes that a vaccine is around the corner, they're being completely misinformed. To me, there should be realistic expectations for society, knowing that the situation that we have here is not going to be solved in literally months, but it could take years. If we're lucky, maybe we have some proper research data by the end of 2021, making it available in 2022, but not before that. And what people forget too, it's not just coming out with the vaccine. It's the whole process of once you go through the clinical approvals, you get it approved by Health Canada, by FDA. You then have to go through the manufacturing process, and then you have to go through the distribution process. And then who should get the actual vaccines first? Should it be those people that are more at risk? Should it be the overall general population? I think the misnomer here within the entire pandemic is that as a percentage of the overall population, it's a relatively small people that are dying. However, what the governments have been doing today is taking a blanket approach. COVID, yes, is killing people, but if you look at it, if you have more of a laser-focused approach and really try to protect those people who have true immune challenges and the elderly, you can have greater resources across the board and, quite frankly, save society. So to me, what our supply chain needs to do is ensure that those Canadians and those people across the board, when they need the vaccine, they will get it. And that's my concern, that people think it's going to be available across the board. There are a lot of people who are anti-vaccine. Well, so what happens to those people? Those people will expose those that do not take the vaccine. So to me, from a Canadian perspective, what we need to do is shore up not just that we have the resources, but we have all the other some medications across the board to support people and really ensure that the distribution is fair and equitable.
Yeah, that's interesting. Let's go back a little bit, because I think you've just given people a lot of information, some of which they might be surprised about. So I agree with you that it looks like, there won't be mass distribution of a vaccine initially in the next 6 months, say. But you seem to be suggesting that you don't think that there will even be the data to approve a vaccine by the second half of next year. And that's quite different from what a lot of the major pharma companies working on this are saying. Why do you think that?
Well, just knowing from the overall, to say, regulatory procedure, the governments really, really have to make sure that when they come out of the phase 3 clinicals, nobody wants a product that's just okay. They want to make sure that it really, really works. So vaccines across the board do not work 100% effectively. Typically, there can be somewhere between a 20 to 30% failure rate that a product doesn't work. So therefore, the overall public wants to make sure that it's safe and effective. So to do that, like for example, you've got the Russian vaccine, you've got the Chinese vaccine. Well, how many North Americans are ready to say, try it on me, it may or may not work? People want to make sure that it's safe and effective, and the government is under incredible pressure, and what they want to avoid is the political pressure of just saying, yes, you've got it, just to satisfy the American need. It's got to be done properly and scientifically, and that means you have to tick off all the boxes. Most new vaccines and medicines typically can take up to 9 years or longer to get approval. What we want to make sure from a global society is that we're safe. And to me, that takes time. You really have to go through the proper due diligence. You cannot just say, we've got a vaccine and good luck. What's the point of it?
Yeah, it's interesting. It seems like you're saying, to me, what I'm hearing is that's what you think should happen. But what I'm feeling is that might not be what happens, that we will probably see emergency approval of some kind of vaccine in the US, at least in the next few months. Anton, what do you think? What's your sort of timeline, and how would you, as a healthcare professional, sort of think about who should get a vaccine first?
Right. So to answer that, one has to tag to that what one can do before a vaccine becomes available. And I will address my thoughts on that in a second. But as you know, over the last few months, we've seen a dramatic change in how people are how people are affected by this disease. Mortality rate is dropping. And whilst we wait for the vaccine, we can't stop. And we shouldn't stop addressing what we call the four priorities: hand washing, wearing a mask, social distancing, and disinfecting, high touch surfaces. Let's not forget about those basics, because when used appropriately, they seem to be working and are effective. Now, when it comes to a vaccine, look, I don't know. I don't have a crystal ball on when a vaccine is going to be approved. I tend to be a little bit more on as you pointed out, the side of we're going to be surprised because of the global demand for something. I mean, we've already seen it in Russia and China. Each have an approved vaccine. But as Aubrey pointed out, the question is how effective is it going to be and how safe is it going to be? And those are the two very important questions. And as healthcare providers, we're obsessed with both, firstly, safety and then efficacy. If you look at the history of vaccines for viruses, I'm not a virologist, but my colleagues tell me that they really fall into three buckets in viruses. Those vaccines that have almost 100% efficacy. For example, polio, measles, rubella, right? Then there's a whole bucket of vaccines such as those for the influenzas, where they may be about 60% effective. From year to year, there's genetic shift in the virus, and then they're not effective the next year. But there's a fair amount of efficacy. And then there's the problem children. The third bucket is the viruses such as HIV, hepatitis C virus, Epstein-Barr virus, where we haven't been able to develop a vaccine despite trying for many years. Now, what we don't know yet is which one of these three buckets COVID is going to fall into. And we certainly hope it's the first bucket, and then a second, perhaps the second bucket. But we'd be very disappointed if we fall into the third bucket. So, Aubrey, I agree with you in terms of safety and efficacy. That's foremost on any a scientist or healthcare provider's mind. But I must say, I think we're going to be surprised by the rapidity of approval, and there'll be lots of opinions on whether it's too early or too late. Regardless, we will learn, and I think the timeline is going to be more compressed than we may have thought.
There's been renewed focus now, actually, ever since President Trump's recovery from COVID-19 on antibody treatments and the idea that you can use those to bridge to a vaccine. Do you think that that's a viable option, or are they going to run into the same kind of supply chain difficulties?
Yes and yes. So there are numerous antibody trials going on to various antigens of the virus and other antigens that may dampen the immune response. That's fascinating. And regardless of the vaccine's efficacy, we're going to learn from that and are already learning. Those results are going to start coming out soon. Will there be supply chain problems? Probably, but not because you're not dealing with the same volume as you are for a vaccine, where you're essentially trying to vaccinate the entire population. There are fewer people who will need antibody treatment. I suspect we'll have less of a supply chain problem. Remember also, there's an enormous economic incentive in COVID for private industry. And they've very much stepped up to the plate across the world because of the opportunity.
And also a lot of them have had an awful lot of government funding.
Yeah. Yep.
And so the other thing that, we seem to set up this dichotomy with COVID unfortunately, between dead and alive. But actually, one of the things that we're seeing as a big impact is this idea of long-term COVID and the effects it can have on you. Randy, I wondered if you could talk about how you see people trying to cope with that and whether there are opportunities as someone who specializes in chronic disease management, how we should be taking care of these people who are just taking a really long time to recover.
Well, we think that there's a great opportunity to help people get their treatment more non-traditional than in the past. We talked about telemedicine earlier. Certainly, if someone can take their vital signs at home, if they can do their temperature, all those things that you a year ago would have gone to the doctor's office to do or to the hospital, if they can do those in their home, relay that to the physician, the clinician, I think we can help people meet those four priorities that Anton mentioned about masking, social distancing, etc. We can make it easier for the non-clinicians like me to be able to take care of ourselves in a way that we feel safe. I don't know when a vaccine's coming out. I don't know anything about antibody treatments, but I do know that I want to make sure that my general health is very good. And that's something that sometimes gets forgotten by everybody, is that many people are skipping doctor's office appointments. They're not seeing their doctor about their heart condition, their cholesterol, their diabetes, anything. And we've seen these deaths of people that they aren't COVID deaths, but they're related because no one went in to get themselves taken care of. So I think we just need to find ways to better deliver care right to the patient, right to the consumer, right where they are in their home. And then they can escalate it as required to bring them in if needed, versus just having everybody trying to go back to the doctor like they normally did. So I think there's great opportunity for companies to deliver services that do that. Even in the U.S., we're seeing the pharmacy chains that are delivering those kind of services in their pharmacies. I got my flu shot earlier this week, but I went to my local pharmacy. I did not have to go to my doctor's office. And it was quick, easy, painless, and set up very well. So there are great opportunities for businesses to react to this and to respond and to help people who normally aren't going to get taken care of.
And Aubrey, you mentioned the mental health impact. Do we have any sense of how big that is? And what are the sort of new options, considering that, some of the drugs that we've had for these kind of conditions have been on the market for over 20 years, and we're facing a dire shortage of mental health professionals?
Yes, I see that to be a huge, huge challenge per se. Specifically, it isn't just about the pharmaceuticals, but how especially the millennial generation are really coping with this. Before COVID, they were anxious to begin with. Today, they are more anxious than ever, and the future looks a lot more bleak. And in fact, what I've heard is that specifically through this particular time period, people are beginning to grieve. They have different stages of grieving of what their old life was and what their current new life is. And the biggest concern is that if you look at, according to the Journal of American Medical Association, the rising rates of mental health and substance use disorder is going up dramatically. The imminent mental health surge will bring further challenges for individuals, families, and communities. In fact, according to the Mental Health Research Canada in September, found very high levels of anxiety and depression, which were slowly climbing across Canada. 22% of Canadians say that they had anxiety, and 13% reported depression most recently. This is really, really causing a tremendous problem. And in fact, what's happening is that there's an addiction problem to opioids that is going through the roof. And in fact, the products that are on the market today have sufficient side effects, including the potential of addiction. There is a gap between the patent medicines on the public formularies to treat anxiety. And in fact, according to the Pan-Canadian Pharmaceutical Alliance, there is negotiation for a mental health drug for the first time. There's been no new mental health drug for the first time in a decade. So you talk about opportunity. It's actually very exciting that here we are at Empower Farm developing a product going through the clinical testing process of CBD, which to date really has been in a format that hasn't been standardized. Standardized means you're going through the proper regulatory process, the proper science. We have a synthetic product that is manufactured in a GMP facility, which is exactly what the healthcare profession wants and the government wants, ensuring that the patients will get exact dosage from from basically batch to batch and the consistency. A lot of people are self-medicating with actually recreational products, and it could be of all kinds. To me, that is a disaster in the waiting. What you want to have is the tools to help the physician community and, more importantly, the patients to know that they're on their way of recovering. If there's something that we can pull away from this whole process that I hope that we can achieve, and that is that from a human perspective, that we learn to respect each other more. And we see a true bifurcation of a certain particular populations, and now the younger population, they're either going to complete avoidance, which is causing tremendous loneliness, or they're going to an incredible herd mentality, which is causing greater infection. There ultimately has to be a respect for humans.
It's an important message. Anton, we've heard from the others about how new innovations can help treat some of the side effects and knock-on effects of COVID-19 and the pandemic. I wondered, from the point of view of a hospital, what does the future hospital look like, and how will technology make a difference so we can cope both with these kind of needs and with the other reasons people go to hospital?
Good question. So, to some degree, I liken the experience that the world has had with COVID to a wartime experience. It's a morbid analogy, but there's some truth to that. And what I'm getting at is the innovations that happened during wartime out of necessity. Just one of many examples in the Vietnam War era, we learned a lot about dealing with how to transport blood products and how to freeze them effectively and preserve them. And those innovations have carried further for decades and advanced the care of patients significantly. Many other healthcare and non-healthcare innovations have happened during extreme times, such as wars, again out of necessity. So the same thing is happening with hospitals. Just a concrete example of what we're doing, and then I'll hypothesize a little bit more about the future. We have started, in fact, this work started prior to COVID, but again, COVID has put it into high gear, a hospital at home concept. And this is now up and running, where given the right conditions, we can treat patients in their home with complex diseases. Just think about that. I mean, you used to go in to have your gallbladder removed and be in for 4 or 5 days. Now, of course, that's come way down. And whilst we can't do surgeries at home yet, there are many complex illnesses that we now can treat at home. And this is not theory. We are doing this right now. That is an incredible advance, which will have long-term benefits. And people are going to build on it. The concept that a hospital is this bricks and mortar thing that, to some degree is a petri dish full of potential infections, is and will be challenged. I think the hospital of the future is going to look quite different. I think people who go into a physical hospital like we know it today are going to be a lot sicker. They're going to stay for an even shorter period of time. And a lot of their treatment is going to be driven by artificial intelligence. Some of that is happening already. It's just all going to go into high gear. The move towards treating people outside of hospitals, together with the efficiencies in artificial intelligence and technology to make it easier to treat people effectively once they are admitted, is probably going to create an interesting dynamic in terms of hospital beds. And we may end up with an excess of hospital beds. And again, this is just an hypothesis, with many hospital beds or facilities aging out. Look, COVID is the COVID pandemic was and is terrible. And it has had awful consequences all over the world. But innovations such as this, together with the scientific innovations, are really very encouraging. And like I said in the beginning, it just shows all of us what we're capable of.
Yeah. No, that is a positive note. I remember, so I used to cover technology in Silicon Valley for the FT, and I remember when I moved to cover healthcare and pharma, people saying it's the end of the hospital. And I think, unfortunately, COVID has shown us that's definitely not true, but definitely an opportunity for the hospital to adapt and decide what really needs to be done in hospital and what doesn't. Okay, so we are still open for questions if anyone has any for our panelists. But I'll carry on with my question, which is really about the coming sort of winter surge, and a lot of people are very, very worried about it. Where are we better prepared, and where is there still a lot of work to be done? And I'm probably going to throw this to everyone, but I'll start with Anton.
Right, so the winter surge is already starting. We think that it's mainly related to the people being in closer proximity. And the sad but again optimistic thing is that we know what we can do to mitigate it if people would just do it. And those are masks, disinfecting high-touch surfaces, hand hygiene, and social distancing. These things work. And if we again use the analogy of really having gone through a time analogous to a wartime, these are relatively simple things that we can do that can make a massive difference. And my sincere hope is that the world will wake up and do these 4 things to try and mitigate the surge that's coming this winter.
Yeah. And I think there was a study out today actually looking about how the hospital surges are now more in areas that don't have mask mandates in the US. So that's really sort of drums home your point. Randy, what do you think about the sort of coming or already started surge, and what we need to do to take action right now?
I won't go into the clinical or the health reasons. I think Anton and Aubrey do a great job of that. But from a business, we've done is make sure that all our employees have the tools they need to stay safe, to be able to continue to work from their homes, to continue to do the social distancing. We also make sure they get the education that's necessary. I think Aubrey mentioned earlier, communications is a big thing, huge. If there was good communications, what you should do, what really works, and what you could do to follow, I think that would be helpful. And just in general, making sure that people have the right information at the right time. There's so much going on now and so much information being put out there that it's really hard for a consumer to understand that, especially in some of our more areas where they don't have local pharmacies, or they don't have a grocery store nearby, or they don't have the Mayo Clinic or something that they can rely on. They're not getting the information they need, and it's up to us as business people and as medical people to make sure we get that information out to them clearly, accurately, and really make it as easy as, those 4 things Anton mentioned are so important. Yet I see so many people just don't even understand how valuable they are.
Yeah. And Aubrey, I'd love to hear your view on that. And also I wanted to pick up on something you said earlier about, whether people will take a vaccine, if it's being held up as the end of this. What do you think we need to learn in order to, if we do have a safe and effective vaccine, sort of promote it to people as the way to help themselves and others?
Well, there's a few things. So first of all, that it's fabulous to hear these two amazing gentlemen talk today. What I think the biggest shift for overall society has been is the appreciation of our health care workers, the front line. So you have this really coming to terms with this human health care, most importantly, from a society perspective, learning to respect each other back and forth and realizing that the overall society good is much more important than the individual good. And for some reason, and I'm going to be a little bit critical, a little bit political, because I have two Americans here, that the Americans think that the individual rights override society. And what they don't realize is that we're all in this together. And if we all work together of basic fundamentals, basically outlined by Anton at least twice now, is just have mutual respect, do the new norm. If you accept the new norm of this is how we're going to deal with each other, then it really transitions easy so everybody can move on with their life. My biggest concern is beyond the mental health, which is a real crisis right now, is the financial well-being, which is compounding the situation. So I think that really, if there's a huge lesson to be learned, is that it is society collectively, we can all together make the world a better place. And to do that, there has to be mutual respect and appreciation. And I think during this particular time period, when we're looking to, well, some people call it the second wave, some people call it the third wave. Quite frankly, somebody said to me just yesterday, said, well, are you prepared for your COVID? Are you prepared for your meeting with your doctor for COVID-19? And I go, COVID-19 is so yesterday's news. I'm at the end of COVID-20 working on COVID-21. Therefore, we have to think about this is going to go on for a while, and let's just accept it. It's a new normal. If somebody said today that we all had to wear hats to protect ourselves from the sun, then we would do it. So to me, we have to look at how can we raise the bar for everybody and make sure we're all safe. There isn't a single conversation that doesn't end today with a Zoom call or whatever saying, please be safe. And that's a simple message, but for whatever reason, people don't realize they are not just harming themselves, but they're harming people around them without even trying. So I want to just say thank you to the two doctors here and the entire teams of what you're doing and advancing medicine for the well-being of everyone.
Well, that's a really great message to bring us to a close, though I will, as a Brit, I will step in and defend the Americans and say there are plenty of people in America who believe that it's important for us to come together and tackle this as a social issue and as a community. And certainly where I live in New York, I don't remember the last time I saw someone without a mask on. So thank you all so much for bringing your expertise to the panel early in the morning for us in the Americas. And actually, before I close, we do have one question. Okay, coming up, this is a surprise, October surprise for you guys. I think they're just going to send it along to me now. I'm just going to... Okay. How will we be ready for the last wave, the support of the mental health of our frontline workers? And I'm going to throw this one to Aubrey because you also, both mental health and frontline workers, but bringing those two issues together. And it's a really important question, actually. Earlier in the week, I was writing about this new wave in the US. And one of the things people said is, physicians aren't putting their hands up to go help on the other side of the country because they're already exhausted and they're worried about the impact on their own communities. And in fact, there was a recent paper that said that actually the US out of 60 countries had the highest rate of physician burnout for those treating COVID-19. So Aubrey, how do you think we support these key workers?
Well, they are very, very important, no question about it. And I think part of it is it comes down to the resources of all the physicians, because there are a lot of physicians and people who are in the front line focused on not just the hospitals, but they're working on the general clinics. So what you need to do is really look at who is engaged and really have a proper rotation system, because there is a lot of unused talent that is not working in the hospital. So what we need to do is those people who are out in the field develop a rotation system. Plus, there's also a lot of retired people who have worked inside the healthcare system for many, many years. Bring them back on a volunteer basis and really have a proper rotation, because there is always going to be fatigue, and because it's ongoing and you're dealing with this human crisis day in and day out, you need to give people a break. And more importantly, we have to think about collectively, how do we have a little bit of fun? Now that may seem a little bit odd, but if we don't have fun and enjoyment and can laugh a little, and more importantly, and I'm going to put my theatrical hat, because I've been a theatrical producer, we actually need a little bit of the arts and entertainment to really appreciate the frontline workers and make sure that we're using all this talent, because let's face it, all of these entertainers are not working because there are no theaters. Bring back people and show appreciation. So that's my thoughts. Totally different than I imagine what you're expecting.
No, I love that, and I'm glad you've, in a way, I understand you are a producer of a Tony-winning musical, so that's I'm glad you put that in there too. I have to say, I completely agree, and I think it's going to be something that's really on people's minds as we go into the holidays. We know we can't do them as usual, and we know we need to keep safe, but we have to find a way of, bringing people together, even if it's virtually, and having a little bit of fun. All right. Brilliant. Thank you all so much for taking the time, and I really appreciated everything you had to say.